Greetings and welcome. We are back in Senior English B, and our objective now is to finish our conversation with William Blake's poems. We'll be looking at two. The first one is on page 751, The Chimney Sweeper, and the second is on 752, Infant Sorrow. I want to point out, first of all, that we're continuing with our discussion of songs of innocence, songs of experience. And so we're going to ask ourselves, which one of those two collections would each one of these poems fit into, and why? Given already your study of the Lamb Tiger as being representative selections from innocence, songs of experience, we can ask then about these last two texts. Where would you put them and why? Let's go ahead first and look at Chimney Sweeper. And as we do this, and as we look at this poem, I want to again just remind you that Blake was an artist. Notice on 750, 751, you have examples of his art. Since we're looking specifically now at the Chimney Sweeper, you can see his little art drawing. Now, I need to get some nomenclature, some vocabulary out of the way. What is a chimney sweeper? Now, see, this is one of those things where maybe you're a little unfamiliar, unless as a child they made you watch that Disney movie Mary Poppins, and you could kind of, learn a little bit about what a chimney sweeper is. You may not even know what that is. Today, of course, we burn wood stoves and the like up a chimney, and some of your houses even maybe still have open fireplaces where there is a chimney. But this is a newer understanding of what we mean by chimney. Does anyone understand what a chimney sweeper was? That's right. The job of a chimney sweeper was to literally climb up inside of a chimney. Okay? So the reason why you had to do this was because of the creosote and soot that built up, because the majority of the time coal was burnt. So this is important you understand this, or this poem's not going to make any sense to you. They didn't burn wood. I mean, hello, I already told you, England is a very small place. You can't go out and cut down trees to burn wood. I mean, you wouldn't have any wood left. So coal is the way that they heat. And their chimneys are fairly large enough that you can get a small child to crawl up inside of the chimney with brushes that will then scrape off the brick. So there will be rungs sometimes inside the chimney. Other times the children are expected to do that thing you maybe did as a child, when you could put your hands and feet against a wall and kind of walk yourself up, and then your feet would kind of hold you there. Well, the problem is some of these chimneys could be in excess of 50 feet. So yeah, you're taking a 5-6-year-old kid, you're telling that kid to climb up with tools on his back, because he's got to clean the chimney. Of course, some of you are already, I can tell by your look, some of you are already thinking, oh, wait a minute, that's going to be a really dirty job. Let's say it what it really is. The coal will stain their skin so much that there is no removing of that stain. After a number of months of doing this, you do not get that off of the skin. It's so black and it's so stained. The children who do this are often homeless or orphan children, and they don't last long. They die. One of the reasons that they die is they fall. Because as you know, if you ever did this when you put your, went up a wall with your feet, if your feet start to slide, it's very hard to hold on with your hands. Of course, that coal is going to become slick if it's not cleaned well as it's going up. So as the children would try to hurry to get up, there would be obviously the possibility of slipping. When normally do you use your fireplace though? What time of the year the most? When it's cold, right. Of course, you cannot clean a chimney with fire in the chimney, right? So that means children are expected to go up the chimney to clean the chimney when it's not in use in the middle of the winter time. So there's fatigue of chilly. So there's lots of stories of children whose extremities just freeze. And then once your hands and your feet freeze, then you can't. It's much easier, by the way, to shimmy up a chimney without shoes on. And so children would oftentimes freeze their feet and their toes. But that's not the primary way they died, believe it or not, because they were pretty agile at getting up and down these chimneys. The way they most of the time died was because of the coal dust that would go into their lungs. And then they couldn't breathe, their lungs would stop working, and they basically would suffocate to death on coal dust. Okay? And this often did not happen while they were working, but rather after a while of doing this, they would become ill. They would be left either in the streets to die or in some kind of small homeless shelter or whatever, orphanage or whatever, where they would die. Child labor laws come about in large measure because people like Blake and others say this is absolutely wrong to ask children to do this. It is a terrible life and a terrible existence. But Blake is going to play an interesting game with us. He's actually going to write 2 poems about this. One he's going to put in Songs of Innocence, and one he's going to put in Songs of Experience, where he kind of talks about this whole thing of being a chimney sweeper. Let's take a look at this poem now and notice who the speaker of the poem is. Right away we're going to want to ask that question. Some of you will find this a powerful statement, a pretty emotional poem even. Let's take a look. The Chimney Sweeper. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me, while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. There's little Tom Darcer, who cried when his head, that curled like a lamb's back, was shaved. So I said, hush, Tom, never mind it. For when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair. So he was quiet, and that very night, as Tom was sleeping, he had such a sight that thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned, and Jack, were all of them locked up in coffins of black, and by came an angel who had a bright key. And he opened the coffins and set them all free. Then down a green plain leaping, laughing, they run and wash in a river and shine in the sun. Then naked and white, all their bags left behind, they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. And so Tom woke, and we rose in the dark and got with our bags and our brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. Now, this is an interesting poem. It has the simplistic rhythms of like a to a lamb type of poem. And yet, you got some really sophisticated types of things going on in this poem in regards to what the reader of the poem is supposed to understand about what takes place. Let's work through it at level 1 real quickly. What actually happens in this poem? The speaker of the poem is who? One of the kids who sweeps chimneys. We're told about how he ends up becoming a chimney sweep. How does he end up becoming a chimney sweep? And for some of my seniors, they're like, what did we just read? 2 things happened to him as a kid. What were they? 1, his mama died. 2, sold? What does that even mean? Sold? What are you talking about? Yeah, you would literally take your child and you would sell your child for a few dollars, and you no longer were accountable for your child. And then your child became a worker. Sometimes in factories, sometimes doing this, and the child then did this work. What's the second thing that we learn in this poem? What goes on in this poem? Do you get a sense of it? There's a dream that takes place, a dream sequence we might even say. What is that dream sequence? And what's this thing about an angel appearing? Right, you've got an angel that appears and takes all of the children out of coffins. What does this mean?
They all died.
All the children who have died. And takes them down to a river. Why down to a river? The children will live and die without ever once having a bath or a shower. Never. They never. Okay? In fact, the notion of taking showers is a relatively new invention, generally speaking. In 1800, very few English people took baths. None of them took showers. That kind of concept was unheard of. But very few took baths. The only ones that took baths were often the people who could afford to do that kind of thing. Oftentimes, for example, orphan children, they're going to live and die and never ever, right? So what do they do to the hair? They do. They just take all the hair off the child. So that way you don't have it clinging to their hair or whatever, right? So it's just one less thing. But what is the tone of this poem at the very end? Because the children, once they are washed in the river, are bright and clean, sunshiny. The sunshine is mentioned. And the very last stanza, they awake. Rose in the dark. Why in the dark? You got it. You start cleaning chimneys in the early morning, right? Once the embers have died out, the children were sent in. Up they would go to clean chimneys and the like. Got with our bags and our brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. What's the tone of this poem at the end?
You don't need to worry.
It's all going to be okay. Where are you going to put this poem? Songs of Innocence or Songs of Experience? It does. It ends up in Songs of Innocence. This poem does. Speaking about a bad event, but kind of almost like a more positive spin on it. Maybe giving children hope that after they die, life will be better for them in the afterlife. By the way, a lot of people read this poem who are adults, and they were really offended by this poem, made uncomfortable by this poem. Why? Because, of course, they all had chimneys, and you employed children to climb up and do that work, right? But the next time you saw a child, you might look at the child a little bit differently. Blake's intentions were thus. Speaking of children, let's take a look now at Infant Sorrow, and we can say this one right out loud. This one, by virtue of the very title itself, is going to tell us that this one belongs in Songs of Innocence or Songs of Experience. Right, experience. When you start talking about things that are bad, sad, and all of that, that's usually going to end up in the experience side of things. Let's take a look. Infant Sorrow. Notice the little drawing even. My mother ground, my father wept. Into the dangerous world I leapt. Helpless, naked, piping loud, like a fiend hid in a cloud. Struggling in my father's hands, striving against my swaddling bands. Bound and weary, I thought best to sulk upon my mother's breast. Whoa, this is an interesting little poem. Now, we got a lot happening in this poem, believe it or not, even though it's a very simple kind of construction. Notice you have a very balanced set of stanzas. You have two, stanzas provided for you. The poem begins by saying what in the first stanza about the infant's birth? My mother ground. What does ground here mean?
Groaned.
Yeah. That is to say, born in pain, right? Groaned. My father wept. Why would the father weep?
Scary.
Yeah, the first assumption, right? The first assumption might be, oh, he's crying because he's so happy. But we're going to get a sense from this poem, no. In other words, this child was born not into joy, but what? What's the title?
Sorrow.
Yeah, it wasn't a happy moment at all. Why would it not maybe have been a happy moment? Why is it possible that some people have children even today and it is not a happy moment at all?
You don't know if the woman's going to live.
Right, you don't know about any number of things going forward. This often is simply reduced down to what? Right? If you lack any kind of economic means, the birth of a child is often not a happy occasion, but oh great, how are we going to write that kind of thing? Notice the next one. Into the dangerous world I leapt, helpless, naked, piping loud, like a fiend in a cloud. What is a fiend? Do you know what this is? What's a fiend? You maybe will remember we used this word in an earlier text in Senior English A when we were talking about in the Beowulf text who was the fiend of that text.
Grendel.
It was Grendel, that nasty monster. Yeah, this fiend is another word for demon or monster. In other words, what does he say? From the moment I was born, I plagued my parents. Yeah, I plagued them. I made their life living hell. Whoa. The second stanza. Struggling in my father's hands means what? He couldn't hold his son very well, right? Struggling in my father's hands. Striving against my swaddling bands. From the moment I was born, he says. This infant says. From the moment I was born, I was struggling. I was fighting. I was wanting to get away. Bound and weary, I thought best to sulk upon my mother's breast. What does the word sulk mean? What does that word mean to you? I mean, I know what it says at the bottom of your book, but put it in your own words. What does the word sulk mean to you?
To take refuge should be.
Yeah, that a happy word or a sad word? Sulk. Yeah, normally it's got pejorative connotations, doesn't it? Pejorative, negative, right? It's not a happy moment. It's a kind of sad situation. Why would a guy write a poem like this and put it in Songs of Innocence? Write that, or Songs of Experience. Put that in your notes. Why does this poem belong in Songs of Experience? See, and I have some students who can't read this poem and really relate to it at all because their upbringing was a happy experience. They lived in a home where they were loved, where they were cherished, where they were told everything is great, where they were told repeatedly, our life is better because you were born. What would it have been like this morning? And by the way, there are people sitting in this building who maybe heard this growing up or even as late as this morning. What would it have been like this morning if the adult in your life had looked at you and said, I wish you would never have been born? I really do. If you had not been born, my life would have been so much better. You were a total mistake. You remain a mistake. I wish you'd never been born. What would that have been like? See, I got students who they don't even relate to that. They're like, no parent would ever say that to a kid. This poem seems to suggest otherwise. This poem suggests there are, in fact, children who are born and grow up completely unloved. They have absolutely nothing in terms of positive experiences. And for them then, looking backwards, they see their birth as not a happy moment, but a kind of tragic moment. A moment of sorrow. A moment that set the trajectory for the rest of their life. Notice the word leapt. I've had students who say when they read this poem, I knew I was leaving at a very young age. I had to get out of my house. I had to get away from these people. I leapt. That word comes, I leapt, as like trying to get away. Again, some of us completely, we have absolutely no way to relate to this at all. We can't believe that anybody would feel that way. I mean, some of us say, I'm excited to leave home, but that's a different kind of project entirely. It's just because I want my emancipation. It's not because I feel unloved. But there are people who grow up feeling unloved, feeling not cherished and not welcome, but in fact wishing they could somehow get away. So there you go, an introduction to those 4 poems of Blake. You'll want to